Whereas visceral sensory nuclei transmit sensory impulses from organs. But regardless, if they're sensory, the cell body is going to be located within the posterior gray horn. These cell bodies, by the way, are part of second-order sensory neurons, or secondary sensory neurons. The primary sensory neurons enter the spinal cord through the dorsal root, and then synapse with this second order, these second-order neurons here within the posterior gray horn. This next slide just says everything we just said. Now, with regard to the autonomic or visceral motor nuclei, remember they provide innervation to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Okay. Surrounding the gray matter within the spinal cord, you have white matter. And that white matter is subdivided by the anterior and posterior gray horns. Okay. So the white matter can be subdivided into anterior white columns, posterior white columns, and lateral white columns. Again, remember, we can substitute ventral for anterior or dorsal for posterior. Some people, instead of using the term columns or column, they'll use funiculus. Plural would be funiculi. Don't do that. We're going to use white columns.
Oh, so don't write that, just realize it.
Okay. I'm just saying in the book you'll read funiculus.
Okay.
Don't use that.
I thought you were telling us to do that.
Okay.
Why don't you like that way? Why do
Because in clinical practice people use columns.
Okay.
Swag. It's easier to spell.
Now it says each column, anterior, posterior, lateral column, contains bundles of axons having a common origin and typically a common destination. Okay, this bundle of axons having the same origin and destination would be called a track. Okay, some of these tracks are ascending, meaning they're sensory. Some of these tracks are descending, meaning they're motor tracks. Okay. So sensory or ascending tracks conduct impulses toward the brain, whereas motor or descending tracks conduct impulses from the brain. Give me an example of a motor track.
Any little skeletal muscle, motor track.
Give me the example of a name of a motor track.
Oh.
Pyramidal tract or cortical spinal tract. All right. Within what white column do most cortical spinal tracts travel? Is it the posterior, the anterior, or the lateral white columns? Most travel within the lateral white columns. Now, I'll give you another example. The tracts which carry sensation for vibration and proprioception. Posterior white columns. So back here, this area here is reserved for tracts carrying vibration and proprioception. All right, let's look at this micrograph of the spinal cord. These would be the posterior white columns. These would be lateral white columns. This area here would be anterior or ventral white columns.
So if they just gave you that picture, but like further down the column, would you be able to tell the difference, or would it all look the same?
You mean?
Like you see how the view, it gives you the view, and like where, if it was like further down or further up, would you be able to tell the difference, or does it all look the same?
I don't know. The only thing I will say is this, is that some areas of the spinal cord, and we're not seeing it here, do not contain lateral gray horns. So we don't see any lateral gray horns here.
Okay.
Okay?
Would that be more common further down in the spinal cord as you?
I feel like it would be more common up because it's
Well,
wider.
We're going to talk about it when we get to the autonomic nervous system.
Okay.
Okay, so let's hold off on that.
Like, so you're saying in the cervical vertebrae, we don't have, say what you just said again about the horn.
Well, you don't see, for instance, in the cervical vertebrae, you don't see any lateral gray horns.
Okay.
Okay?
So you're right.
Those are reserved for those segments of the spinal cord serving the autonomic nervous system.
Okay.
Hashtag bless.
Okay, which is going to be part of the thoracic and part of the lumbar, and then part of the sacral segments. Now, what do we call this gray matter that connects the two sides here? The gray commissure. And then this little canal in the center is called what? Central canal. Okay? Remember, there's a posterior median sulcus, but an anterior or ventral median fissure. The reason it's called a fissure along the ventral surface is because it's a lot deeper. Have we ever talked about syphilis?
We have not.
Okay. Syphilis can affect the spinal cord. Syphilis can affect the spinal cord. Syphilis can present in different stages.
I have a psychology, group project on that, on syphilis.
Good. Good. Have you started working on it yet?
Yes, we have.
It's due Tuesday.
No, it's not. No, my part's due to, like, not due for the class, but due to our group.
Have you ever heard of a chancre?
No. We're talking about the Tuskegee syphilis
Tuskegee,
experiment.
right,
Yeah.
right.
That's what you.
Okay.
One.
All right, let's talk about syphilis. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease. In its primary stage, its earliest stage, it presents as a painless ulcer. It's called a chancre. Okay? Now, most males recognize when they have a chancre because it's present along the external genitalia. In about 50% of females, that chancre is located on the pudendum, and they notice it. But the other 50% of females, it's located along the inner vaginal walls. So it can go unrecognized, particularly because it's painless. It's not like a herpetic ulcer, which causes pain. All right? So, for that reason, many women who have primary syphilis do not seek treatment. Now, give it a few weeks, and that ulcer is going to go away. Does that mean that in those women who went untreated, that the syphilis went away? No, no. And so, typically, maybe a month or two later, they can develop manifestations of secondary syphilis. Now, secondary syphilis can present in a number of ways, but one of the most common ways it presents is as a rash. But the rash can resemble a lot of other rashes. So typically what will happen is you have a female who had primary syphilis that went unrecognized, and then she develops a rash. Okay. Then she goes to a primary care physician, or maybe she goes to her gynecologist, because a lot of women do that, and they say, I have a rash. And in an effort to help the physician, they'll say, but you know what I think it is? I was doing some work this past weekend in my garden, and I think I came into contact with some poison ivy.
It'd be itchy, right?
And then sometimes it can be itchy, right? And so the physician, because it looks like a lot of other rashes, will prescribe a steroid cream and maybe an antihistamine. And he says if it doesn't go away within a week or two, come back and see me, with the intent being then I'll refer to a dermatologist perhaps. Okay? Now, the truth is, whether she received the appropriate antibiotic for the secondary syphilis or not, give it a couple of weeks and that rash is going to go away. But if in fact, if she was untreated, if she didn't receive antibiotic therapy, did the syphilis actually go away? No, no. So then time passes, and she doesn't know the difference. When I say time passes, it can be 2 years, it can be 10 years, it can be 20 years. And then suddenly she develops manifestations of tertiary syphilis. Now, tertiary syphilis can present in a number of different ways. One way is early onset of dementia.
Me earlier today.
In fact, for that reason, when someone comes in with early onset dementia, we always do a serologic study for syphilis. What's called an RPR or a VDRL. Okay? Another way in which it can manifest is by causing infection. This is what you call a mycotic infection of the aortic arch, for instance, or sometimes another large blood vessel, which leads to weakening of the wall and aneurysm formation. So again, when someone has a thoracic aneurysm, we always check an RPR or VDRL. A third way in which it can manifest is by a condition called Tabes dorsalis. This is where it infects the posterior white columns of the spinal cord and can affect vibration or proprioception. And so you lose the ability to perceive how your feet are positioned with respect to the floor, for instance.
Sounds fun.
Okay? And so people who have Tabes dorsalis tend to walk with a wide base gait, because this is a more stable gait, particularly because they can't feel the floor. They can't feel how their feet are positioned with respect to the floor. So they assume a wider base, just like an infant would, a toddler would when they're first learning to walk. Okay? When a toddler first learns to walk, they have a wide base gait. They don't pick their feet up too much. So that way they can keep in constant contact with the floor. They look down a lot. Same thing holds true for these people with Tabes dorsalis. Okay? So the idea here is that these posterior columns transmit ascending tracts for proprioception
So do they fall a lot?
if they don't look down. Okay? Because they lose that position sense.
At what point? Wait, does syphilis have a cure?
Yes,
Penicillin.
penicillin. Penicillin, the original treatment.
What if you're allergic? I was just thinking.
Rocephin.
Oh.
Rocephin.
Good thinking,
Which
Sarah.
is a third generation cephalosporin. Now, when
So
that
is
was
this
someone,
common?
and I used to work in at the time they called it a VDRL clinic. Throughout my medical school career, I was constantly working. I think I told you this, right?
Yeah, because your
In the
father
prison.
hated the
Because he
boys.
thought that would make us better people.
Do you
Wait,
think it
what?
did?
Well, it gave me a wider breadth of experience, I'll tell you that. So having worked in a prison and working in VDR, you saw life. You get to see a lot of people. So in a sense, I think it was a good thing. Although at the time, I didn't think so. In fact, I'll tell you something very interesting. When I first started working was like, I don't know, toward the end of my freshman year of medical school. We saw a lot of syphilis, and you'd see a lot of gonorrhea, and they traveled together, syphilis and gonorrhea. So if someone presented with syphilis, you always checked them for gonorrhea and vice versa. And then all of a sudden, herpes became a lot more prevalent. Up until that time, if someone came in with syphilis or gonorrhea, you could eradicate it really with a single injection. Okay? But still, if they got syphilis and gonorrhea and you told them the bad news, they were like, oh no. Okay? However, once herpes came along, herpes was now lifelong. There was no cure for herpes. So that same person, and these people were frequent flyers, they keep coming back with the same thing.
Frequent fly.
Now, once herpes became more prevalent, if you told them, okay, you have gonorrhea or you have syphilis, they'd be like, oh, thank you, doctor. Why would they say thank you now?
Because it's
They
one
get
shot
rid of
and you're
that.
done.
Yeah, because now they realize, well, it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
I could have had herpes. Okay? And so for a while, that's what people feared. And then it was funny because in the kind of early to mid 1980s, HIV started becoming prevalent. And then people would come into the clinic and you'd say, I hate to tell you this, but you have herpes. And they'd listen waiting for the other foot to drop, the shoe to drop rather. And they'd say, you mean I don't have HIV? And you'd say, no, you don't have HIV. And now they'd say, thank you, doctor. Why? Because now they're happy to have herpes, meaning that
And now
they don't
it's
have
just
HIV.
But
So it's
herpes
funny.
is still lifelong.
Herpes is still lifelong, but it wasn't. But when HIV came along, it was a death sentence.
Gotcha.
Okay, because we had no idea how it was transmitted, how people acquired it in the beginning. You know, so all we knew was it killed people. Okay, so it just shows you how your view of these different diseases depends upon
Changes, right.
the environment in which it's occurring.
And you were there when all that was going?
Yes, yes, it was a very interesting time. It was a very interesting time. Okay, now let's remember the somatic motor pathway. Upper motor neurons begin in the primary motor cortex. They travel via cortical spinal
Jeez,
tracts
Colin, what do
down
you do
the
on the
internal
weekends?
capsule,
Sit in my bed.
down to the brainstem. These tracks cross at the medulla, and in the spinal cord. Where do these tracks run? Within what portion? Lateral white columns. Okay? And they're going to synapse at the appropriate level of the spinal cord depending upon what muscle they're providing innervation to. Once they synapse, the lower motor neuron, which begins in the anterior gray margin, okay, gives off axons which lead via the ventral root, joins the spinal nerve, and these spinal nerves are going to participate in some type of plexus from which is going to emerge a peripheral nerve that's going to carry the axon to the muscle that's being innervated. Does that make sense to everyone? We'll kind of talk about this plexus business in a little more detail.